Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all panelists and participants from all over the world. I would like to welcome you to our event on investing in vaccine production and supply for lower and middle income countries. The event is organized by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in partnership with the World Health Organization. Our event is for 90 minutes. My name is Ermias Piatkiling from UNCTAD. I'll be facilitating this meeting together with our colleague from the World Health Organization, Dr. Jisui Dong.
Thank you, Ermias. I would also like to welcome all panelists and participants. I'm Jisui Dong, the head of local production and assistant unit in the Regulation and the Pre-Qualification Department of WHO. As some of you may recall, the first UNCTAD WHO webinar on investing in vaccine production and supply for LMICs took place this March. The webinar brought together key international and strategic players. Panelists underscored the contribution of building production capacity in LMICs to overcome supply bottlenecks, promote equitable access to vaccines, ensure availability of routine vaccines, and build capacity for pandemic preparedness. Ermias.
During the first webinar, panelists also identified the technological, financial, and market complexities of expanding vaccine production in lower and middle-income countries. Yet to a large extent, they pointed out the potential to overcome the challenge by coordinating their efforts and also by building strategic partnerships among manufacturers, investors, and the technology providers. They also pointed out the potential of taking a regional approach to support the sustainability of investment.
So the objective of today's webinar is to take stock of partnerships to date and to discuss the way forward in intensifying partnerships for vaccine production in LMICs. Today, we have brought together most of the panelists of the March webinar with additional key strategic players. Panelists will address the scope of their initiatives, the steps they have undertaken so far to implement their initiatives, the challenge they have encountered, and their view on the way forward.
Our event will start with opening remarks, followed by 2 roundtable discussions. I would like to inform participants that they can contribute to this event by posting questions and comments and feedback in the live board. Towards the end of this meeting, we will be able to present your comments and questions to the panelists so that they can reflect or provide a response. Kindly note that if any of your opinions, concerns are raised by any other participant in the live board, you can just click to like the question or comment. So that way you can know what is the most important question for you. We are pleased to have UNCTAD's Deputy Secretary General with us. Without further delay, I would like to invite Ms. Isabel Durant, who is the Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, to provide her opening remarks. Ms. Durant, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. To all of us, to all of you, ladies, gentlemen, excellencies, friends, colleagues, I too would like to welcome you to this session on pandemic preparedness beyond COVID-19, in which we will discuss building capacity for production and supply of vaccines in low and middle income countries. We are all aware of the shortcomings of the current global vaccine supply system. The first COVID-19 vaccine was administered in the UK already more than 10 months ago. Yet, in many low-income countries and encompassing a large part of Africa, only a very small fraction of the population has received the COVID-19 vaccination. And this despite the global cooperation through COVAX, the COVID-19 vaccine global access program. So there are numerous reasons for the stark inequality in access to vaccines, including trade-related measures that affect global supply chains of vaccines, as well as the impact of the early competitive procurement of vaccines by developed countries. Given the significance of vaccine production, we convened a meeting on this topic earlier this year in March. At that time, key international and strategic players discussed efforts to build vaccine production and supply capacity in low and middle income countries. Panelists underscored the need for a benefits of globally distributed production capacity in terms of ensuring equitable access to life-saving technologies. Today, we want to take stock of progress made, partnerships that have been established, challenges encountered, and next steps required to move forward. This is an important topic for UNCTAD. We have worked on pharmaceutical sector development in developing countries for many years, precisely because of the sector's importance for national public health systems. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated countries' vulnerability in this regard. The crisis led by global supply chain constraints for medicines, medical supplies, and of course, vaccines. From our work in this area, I would like to point out the following insights. Past experience suggests that countries push to build vaccine production capacity during a crisis, but are quick to abandon these efforts once the crisis has abated. This is exactly what happened during the H1N1 crisis. Hence, the lesson learned in that countries and development partners should remain committed to building and preserving vaccines production in good times, so the capacity is there when a crisis strikes. As regards our contribution to this task, we will continue to monitor progress, offer consensus building fora like this one, and collaborate with partners on important local production initiatives. Second, we need to recognize the technological, financial, and regulatory complexities of vaccine productions. We applaud the WHO for establishing the mRNA hub in South Africa and the generous financial contribution by development partners. Also, other similar programs launched by bilateral, regional, and international development assistance providers are, of course, very positive developments. Looking at it, an investment through an investment angle, the question of the business case for investing in vaccine production and how to make this investment sustainable are, of course, important. The challenge is to ensure the necessary demand as well as to preserve the capacity built during a crisis for future preparedness. Without continuous financial support to keep the required skills and facilities operating, this is hardly feasible. Moreover, while it is important to have globally distributed production, not all countries should invest in bulk vaccine production capacity, as this would lead to excess supply. However, vaccine and biopharmaceutical value chains are dense, involving complex sets of inputs, packaging, and delivering mechanisms. This offers many opportunities for suppliers to participate in the chain. A regional perspective can also add to the business case. The aggregation of demand can assist the sustainability of investment into vaccine production. A regional approach would require building consensus and strong cooperation among low and middle income countries for regional vaccine value chains. This is an area we need to further explore, and it's maybe not the easiest one. Finally, there is the issue of intellectual property related to vaccines. the support to grant a waiver from the obligation of the WTO agreement on trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights related to vaccines is an important development. In the TRIPS Council meeting earlier this month, WTO members noted points of convergence on how to provide a response on intellectual property to COVID-19. It would be an important accomplishment if a substantive consensus could be reached on this issue before the MC12, the ministerial conference of the WTO, very soon in this end of November. I also would like to mention that in the case of a vaccine production, voluntary partnership often yields better outcomes in terms of sharing know-how than regulatory approval. Countries could therefore consider such partnership as complementary. Finally, at the same time, we should consider all potential policy tools and incentives developed countries can offer to their research institution and vaccines manufacturers to transfer technology and know-how to their counterpart in low and middle income countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, the task ahead is not easy. The journey from nationalism to equity in production and supply of vaccines is complex and will require long-term commitment. I hope that we will be able to do that. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Durant. Thank you for your long-term leadership and your support advice in promoting local production. And now I have the honor to invite Dr. Rodrigo Gaspar to deliver opening remarks. Dr. Gaspar is a director of the Regulation and Pre-Qualification Department in the Access to Medicines and Health Products Division of WHO. Dr. Gaspar is also my director because the local production and assistance unit is under the Department of Regulation and Pre-Qualification. So Dr. Gaspar, if you please.
Thank you, Jisui. It's a pleasure to be here, and let me thank the efforts that teams from both institutions have put on the effort to organize this webinar. And let me welcome all of you this very important webinar. Colleagues and friends, let me start to say that we are still in a fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. We have heard several times in the last weeks some declarations from governmental and non-governmental organizations that might send us in a direction that we were almost ending at least this first phase. We are confronted with a health situation globally that has been worsening in the last couple of weeks, and the numbers that were shared by the Director General from WHO on the last pressers highlight that aspect. It's not over yet. It will not be over until everybody is taken care. And as we are seeing the deployment of vaccines, we are also looking for the first time for significant potential deployment of therapeutics. Just to share with you, I just came from a meeting about the preparedness for therapeutics deployments. If a number of scientific criteria are met, but we are already looking at the preparedness for the future. So it's important to put in context, because what we do today is also challenged by an epidemiological situation that is not completely stabilized. And we need to separate what is the operational response on the day-by-day basis to the strategic response that needs to look into the future, not only to this pandemic, but also for the preparedness and response for further pandemics or global health threats. The number of weekly reported deaths might be declining, but it's still at almost 50,000 per week. And as October 10, 238 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 with over 6.3 million doses of vaccine were administered. So, however, 2.4 billion doses are needed still to vaccinate those who are at risk in the world: health workers, the elderly with underlying conditions, and other vulnerable groups. And just to repeat time and time again, the appeal from WHO and other global agencies that if we missed, and we missed the target of the 10% of the population in each country to be vaccinated by the end of September, and we missed that target in more than 50 countries, we shouldn't miss the target to vaccinate at least 40% of the population in each country by the end of the year. This huge effort brings everybody together, from governments, non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, and important number of funders from the public, private, and social sectors. COVAX recent supply forecast in September predicts some difficulties still on issues that pertain to scale-up challenges and manufacturing sites. And this highlights exactly what is the major problem that we are discussing here today. Ramping up local vaccine production capacity is seen by many countries as a way to diversify the sources of supply, increase timely and equitable access, and safeguard national and regional health security. This sentiment was reflected with the adoption of a landmark resolution on strengthening local production at the 74th World Health Assembly in May 2021, where more than 100 member states co-sponsored the resolution. Resolution WHA 74-6 on strengthening local production calls upon member states to further engage in partnerships and on WHO to continue to foster it. Following this World Health Assembly in June, high-level participants from member states, UN agencies, and other international organizations were present at the World Local Production Forum, organized by the unit led by GSWI in our department, and explore different angles to promote local production of health products to enhance access. The special session on building capacity to enhance access to vaccines for COVID-19 and beyond during the forum, concentrated in issues and key elements like having a skilled workforce, market information, and financing mechanisms, among others, that normally are not referenced when we are only discussing the aspects of technological transfer and access. Partnerships and collaborations were frequently recognized as critical elements to strengthen local vaccine production during the World Local Production Forum. And the forum also recognized that the manufacturer's role in promoting local production and recommended an exploration for a mechanism to stimulate industry engagement and to provide a platform to strengthen collaborations and harness opportunities for the diffusion of technology to low and medium income countries. Quality is key of improving access and achieving healthcare outcomes. Strengthening local production of vaccines should also go hand in hand with strengthening the regulatory system. And we are pleased to see that the discussions on the last 4 months made it very evident for those who didn't have a key priority, these two aspects to go hand by hand. Vaccine production is complex. Promoting sustainable local production of quality assured vaccines requires an holistic approach. Government commitment and support, and building a conducive ecosystem are essential aspects. Effective partnerships are crucial. And we have to welcome, as it was referred before, the platform of different partnerships that are behind the initiative led by WHO and the government from South Africa on the recent mRNA hub. But this is only one of the many projects that are being now implemented all over those critical areas. WHO will continue to work tirelessly with member states, partners, and all the stakeholders to support countries in promoting local production and technology transfer to improve access. I'm sorry I cannot stay with you for the entire length of the webinar because other tutors call me. So I wish you fruitful discussions, and you are certain that GC will be reporting on our next meeting today about the outcomes of this webinar. Thank you so much to all of you to participate. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Gaspard, for your leadership and the insightful remarks today. To begin, we have 2 distinguished speakers who will highlight the progress of initiatives and the ongoing works of the European Union and the Africa CDC. So now I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director General at the Directorate General for International Partnerships. Mr. Seychelles is responsible for the Directorates of Human Development, Migration, Governance, and Peace and Resources in European Commission. Mr. Seychelles, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. As has already been said, the COVID pandemic has highlighted a number of vulnerabilities and inequalities which greatly hamper our ability to deal with health crisis of this magnitude. We certainly have an overall problem in meeting peak demand, and this is a global challenge, and not just for vaccines. We've seen this problem practically with all the medical countermeasures from time to time during the management of this pandemic. But also there is a major distribution problem. The distribution capacity is certainly not at all equally distributed. And I would really emphasize that this is not just a concern for the countries or regions directly affected by this, it's a concern for all of us, because it means we are less able to deal with a pandemic or a local outbreak that could develop into a pandemic if it erupts in certain parts of the world. This is a global problem. It's not just a regional problem. And I would like to highlight the particular challenge faced by Africa in this regard. Of course, there are problems everywhere, but Africa is very much in a particularly difficult situation. I'll just give some key statistics to highlight this. If I look at the production capacity for pharmaceuticals in general, so vaccines and all other pharmaceuticals and indeed other health products, in 2020, there were only 600, mostly small and medium enterprises, 600 pharmaceutical manufacturers across the whole of Africa. 80% of this capacity is distributed in just 8 African countries, and only 4 of those are sub-Saharan African countries. So this is, I think, a figure which speaks for itself. Only 4 countries had more than 50 manufacturers. 22 countries in Africa have no local production of any pharmaceuticals at all. And overall, Africa imports 99% of its vaccines and 94% of its medicines. And only one manufacturer in Senegal manufactures a vaccine benefiting from WHO pre-qualification. Now, this is a problem certainly in itself. It's also a double problem because Africa has a disease burden which is double the global average, unfortunately. And it's certainly that we talk about COVID these days, but from the African perspective, COVID is dwarfed by other infectious diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and the whole host of other often neglected or forgotten conditions. And let's not forget an explosion of NCDs at the same time. Now, looking to the future, and this is where the economic dimension comes in, Africa is expanding demographically, and it will represent a quarter of the world's population by 2050. So the question, even industry should be asking, and I know it is asking this question and looking with a different light, is what will the global pharmaceutical and vaccine market look like in the years to come? And if we combine all these considerations, this is not just a problem, it's an opportunity for a multiple win situation, a win for Africa, certainly, but also, I think, an opportunity for industry to look at Africa in a different way. And this is why we are engaging in an initiative to respond to the political call, the clear political leadership shown by the African continent, the African leaders, who have established a target, starting with vaccines, to produce 60% of vaccines needed by Africa in Africa by 2040. And of course, they have already taken a number of concrete steps in that regard, primarily under the leadership of the African CDC, the Partnership for the African Vaccine Manufacturing, which is already making significant steps forward on this. And as the European Union and the European Commission, we are very happy to support this initiative. It is also in our interest to support this initiative. I'll be very clear about this. Africa and Europe are very much interlinked in many ways. And therefore, it is also something we are very happy to support. Now, we have put in place a Team Europe initiative, so mobilizing European institutions, European Investment Bank, and member states, because this is not just a question of funding. Of course, a lot of funding will be needed, we have put on the table already an initial investment of 1 billion euros from the European institution side and the European Investment Bank. And also to that, European member states will be contributing. But also there is a need to support with the transfer of knowledge and know-how and to really facilitate the interest of investors and innovators. Very briefly, what is this initiative all about? It's made up of three main areas of work. The first is the supply side. We need, first of all, to identify and systematically address the obstacles to investment, which so far have really kept Africa off the radar of pharmaceutical manufacturers. So this needs to be a systematic approach, and we are working very much with our African partners on this. Secondly is, of course, to de-risk the investments. This, of course, is already being done in a number of cases through the European Investment Bank, and to reduce the risk investing in a new market to an acceptable level that would incentivize the industry to do that. And a strong element of tech transfer. I mentioned a moment ago also the fact that this is not just a problem in moments of peak demand. Africa has a need also to have much better solutions, and we all need better solutions for diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, HIV. And we also need to address research to areas which research is simply not addressing at the moment. Like, for example, there is not enough research on pediatric vaccines. We are seeing, for example, that at the moment we don't have a single vaccine, excuse me, a single vaccine which is authorized anywhere for infants in terms of diseases like COVID. So we have a problem there. But the supply side on its own is not going to be enough. We also need to work, and this would be the second area of work, for the demand side. Africa is very fragmented, 54 countries. There is a lot, I think, of scope, but this is certainly something that Africa certainly needs to do for itself, but there's a lot of scope to consolidate demand, whether it's through instruments like joint procurement. We have direct experience of this in Europe, and it helped us greatly also during the pandemic. Some of our smaller member states, for example, probably would not have been able themselves to easily purchase vaccines. Joint procurement is one answer to that, but also the removal of trade barriers. The manufacturing of vaccines and pharmaceuticals is an ecosystem, and trade barriers between African countries, of course, would greatly disincentivize investment. So there is now the possibility under the African Continental Free Trade Area, and health should indeed be one of the first sectors to benefit from the possibilities offered by that agreement. That's the second side, is what we can do to help Africa consolidate the demand side. And thirdly, very important for the pharmaceutical sector and the vaccine manufacturing sector is the regulatory environment. This is a sector which needs and must be highly regulated. Again, here, Africa is taking bold, strong steps. There's been already the decision to establish the African Medicines Agency, and ratifications by African countries are coming in fast. This effort needs to continue because this would greatly help, for example, to really streamline and provide governance to pharmaceutical regulation across the whole continent, also working with the regional economic communities. This would also help provide, for example, solid governance for important aspects like clinical trials to ensure that treatments and medicines are developed which are tailored for Africa's needs. Pharmacovigilance, the fight against counterfeit medicines. There are estimates that 40% of all medicines circulating in Africa are counterfeit. And therefore, this is in itself a great disincentive for investment. But the regulatory environment is something also that we are very well placed to help. Europe is itself a regional regulatory model, the only one in the world. And we therefore believe we are an ideal partner for Africa as it proceeds along the same journey. So to conclude, clearly, this is and must be an African-led initiative, and this is indeed what is happening. We're very glad to see that so strongly. Europe stands ready to help, both in financial terms, in terms also of its own experience and expertise available, and we are fully mobilized to support our African friends in this important endeavor, which is not just in Africa's interest, it's also in everyone's interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sikel. It's really very enlightening presentation. We also work in the African region. In particular, now we are working on antibiotics production. And the problems, most of the problems you have identified are really visible there, despite the having a very large installed capacity to produce most of the essential antibiotics. The region suffers from imports of falsified and substandard products. And also there is a lack of pooled procurement mechanisms to assist the industry. With that, I would like to invite Mr. Nikes Ndembi, who is a senior advisor, science advisor to the African CDC director. Nikes, you have the floor. Nikes, we can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Good, thanks. Thank you so much. I think definitely the DJ has really set the stage for this presentation. So it's my life is much more easier here. So everything has been said. So, but what I'm going to really touch on is really how we leverage on the existing partnerships. So I think we've all agreed that partnership and collaboration will really go a long way to strengthen local production. So when you look at this slide, it really provides you the current situation in terms of projected access to vaccines. These are projected access. So really close to about 26% expected through the COVAX facility. As we speak, we have received less than 100 million. Then about 31% from the Africa-led initiative, the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Tax Team. We still have some gaps there to meet our target of 60%. But this target was set before actually the spread of new variants, which may require at least moving that target to 70, 80% if you really want to be sure that we adequately control this pandemic. And then the population size estimate, you all know, is 1.3 billion. So it's quite important to put that in context. If you extrapolate that with the 60% coverage, we're close to about 800 million people that be eligible and in need of at least, we need to get vaccinated. So that's why we're riding on that to be able to build a really strong and sustainable vaccine manufacturing ecosystem. I think is a lesson. I think out of COVID-19 pandemic, we strongly believe that we're going to build that ecosystem with some of the enablers that we're discussing that the previous speakers have alluded to. So as part of the partnership, which is one of the key mandates of the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, that intermediation and partnering. If you look at it closely, it's, we aim at really pulling resources, and the concept that Martin did mention earlier, it's quite important, and we're looking to that carefully. As part of that as well, we've seen that around the market shaping for commodities as part of the COVID-19 response. That was really, an important development in terms of that COVID-19 response, the financial, the human and technical expertise for that broader impact. And also building on existing initiatives that are already existing on the continent, including the Africa Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative and others, bilateral arrangement. So the types of partnership in terms of inter-agency partnerships, the Harvard we mentioned, the WHO CP, and as well as around funding, financing partnerships, you have the MasterCard Foundation, the Afrexim Bank and Africa Development Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates and Team Europe, which has been trusted partners as well, and the MasterCard Foundation. Those are kind of funding institutions and partners that we are really working closely to be sure that we meet that continental aspiration. Around technology, innovation, development and partnerships, for sure, the manufacturers, the medicine patent pool, and then also those multinational that are working closely to ensure that also that we have capacity and also being able to increase our production capacity on the continent. R&D capacity, there are several networks of universities, including the African Research Universities Alliances, the coalitions of the African Research and Innovation through the NIH. And then the first one is through the African, the ARUA, through the African Academy of Science. We're building on that to be sure that we have a pull around talent development. So what are the activities so far? You've heard at least the speakers have alluded to the South African medical research hubs, I mean the SA tech transfer hubs in collaboration with the Africa CDC, WHO, the medicine patent pool. I think all those aims really to achieve that continental aspirations. And then the engagement, we have engaged several front runners on the continent, about 17 with the capacity of at least increasing the current demand. I think that it's also important to start looking at that market shaping that we've all are really concerned about. The engagement with donors, there's a strong commitment from the AU member state as well as partners. We had a joint partners forum, which actually really showed the commitment from stakeholders and partners to be able to support this continental initiative. The engagement with WHO and the regulatory authority, I think is quite important. I think Martin emphasized on that. I think if something has to be done, at least resources driven to move the regulatory in terms of quality. Though AMA is really becoming to force, if you look at it in terms of architecture, member states that have actually ratified, the big players, including South Africa, Nigeria, have not ratified. I think the big five, at least 50% of the continental populations. I think we need to look into that closely in terms of when we engage subsequently, move forward our initiative around vaccine manufacturing. So these are some of the partnering initiatives. The mRNA Hub, it's also good to point out that we're going to, as partners, start looking into how we can fully operationalize that mRNA hubs to start driving this initiative. The Saving Lives, Saving Economy from the MasterCard Foundation has 4 pillars. And one of the key pillars around that, the third pillar is around expanding vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Then the CEPI, we've entered through an MOU with CEPI in terms of exchange of data. We're looking at the surveillance around vaccine manufacturing and the potentials and being sure where we can actually put in the resources to make the difference. And also around leveraging on COVID-19 and COVAX experience. The ongoing hub developments, we're also quite sure we're working with Team Europe and other partners will let us drive this. Now we have a hub in the Southern Africa region. We still have to look carefully how we can embark into getting the 4 hubs that are left to be able to cover the 5 AU geographical regions. And lastly, of course, that definitely the coordination and the support to member states that are willing to embark into this. If you look at this map, it's quite impressive. We have about 17 countries that have expressed an interest in vaccine manufacturing. This is incredible. And then it tells us the message, the strong message is here that really the continent want to embark into this, and that we have all learned lessons in terms of how do we want to move forward from really importing 99% of vaccine to start producing at least by 2040, 60%. I think this is a strong message to the international community and as well from the continent. I think AMA, I'm just providing that currently it's a little bit fragmented. I think I mentioned that already. We're moving towards that kind of harmonization, which will actually go a long way in our vaccine manufacturing strategy. So how do we plan that? Just on AMA as an example, We currently have AVREF, which is the first really Pan-African network for the regulation of medical products. Then move to AMRH, the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Programs, and now TWAS are really AMA. I think those are really key steps and really important steps as well, and coming really timely to ensure that we speak with the same voice around regulatory. I think it's also important to emphasize that AMA really had to build the regulatory capacity in terms of strategizing on R&D processes on the continent, and also have a continental impact as far as regulatory is concerned. So I think I'm just on the last slide, putting a little bit what is missing, what definitely needed to be in place in terms of the expertise, in terms of the regulatory training, in terms of regulatory infrastructure. I think that's really key. If you look at it and summarize a little bit in terms of countries that have achieved maturity level 3, we only have 2 on the continent so far, despite that high aspiration to actually move into the vaccine manufacturing ecosystem. I think, thank you all, and I'm delighted to be here. Over, back to you, Myers.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I think the two presentations in a way highlighted the need assessment for technical cooperation on the one hand, and also the scope of the response designed by development partner on the other hand. The first roundtable discussion will take stock of the current partnerships for supporting vaccine manufacturing capacity in lower and middle-income countries. We have the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, the African Development Bank, and the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiatives represented in this roundtable. Without further delay, I would like to invite Mr. Matthew Downham, who is the Sustainable Manufacturing Lead at CEPI. Matthew, you have the floor.
Amias, thank you very much indeed, and thank you also to the organisers for this opportunity to present and provide an intervention today. I think one of the key lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic is just how collaborative, multi-stakeholder, and multifunctional that stakeholder interaction has to be from across the global community to combat epidemic or pandemics most effectively. Indeed, CEPI this year has launched a survey mapping the vaccine manufacturing landscape across Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, Western Pacific, and the Middle East. And from that, the respondents have really articulated not just their aspirational plans, but also the drive to establish or expand vaccine manufacturing, articulating that their plans are often linked with international consortia, that the investments are often identified, and the source of those investments are identified too. In other words, where those private investors will provide that level of support. However, they also stress the government endorsement and/or coordination is a critical component. So you can see how some of the feedback that we have received leverages into some of the key discussions today. Certainly from a vaccine manufacturing expansion or establishment perspective, especially in low middle income countries, it requires a champion. It requires someone to provide that oversight, that strategic leadership, but it also requires local ownership, and that is critical and key as well. Local ownership maybe of vaccine manufacturers, organizations, or with collaborative partnership and associations or networks. So if you think about this moving forward in terms of the discussions for today, progress is being made. This has just been articulated really nicely. Some of the specific activities for Africa. We have Patrick Tipo here as well from the AVMI, the associations that are being developed to support Africa moving forward, and the great work that's progressing there. And CEPI is very proudly part of that story, as Nisez has just articulated, not just through the relationship with the Africa Union CDC, but also together with the COVAX partners, as mentioned as well. So progress is being made in some countries, some regions. We have heard that it has been stalled as a consequence of COVID. However, moving forwards, collaborative partnerships are going to be required to pursue key activities related to vaccine manufacturing. They are such things as technical transfers, how to build those partnerships between vaccine manufacturers, regional vaccine manufacturers, and transfer effectively, not just the technology, but the analytical capabilities and all the logistics required to support that vaccine manufacturing initiative. Workforce and skill development is a key component as well. And this is something that the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force has been focused and working on very much. Strengthening weak regulatory environments. Again, this is something else we've heard through the CEPI 2021 survey. Bringing together national regulatory authorities to try and harmonize and coordinate the activities to focus on a region. The efforts with the the Africa Medicines Agency, as Nsays has just shared, is a key example of where that really is coming to great fruition. So what's important is that viable international cooperation. It's required across each regional continent to champion, as I mentioned, the vaccine manufacturing capacity and capability. And certainly, and I'd like to reference that the UN World Health Assembly 74th meeting that was early this year, it was May this year, that provided some of that counsel in terms of a resolution to strengthen local production of medicines and other health technologies to improve access. That provides an element of steer, a road for champions to be established per region, not just in Africa. So the right path has been set. It's beginning to take shape. We're seeing it very nicely, obviously, with Africa. Local ownership is key. And again, we've seen that with the regional organization in Africa that Nsays has just articulated very nicely. But we need that in all the other regions as well. We need that in the Middle East. We need that in Latin America and the Caribbean, and maybe in Southeast Asia, Western Pacific, much more advanced in Southeast Asia, Western Pacific, arguably. And lastly, there, investments are going to be needed, obviously. They're going to need to be coordinated because we can't have a kind of build and decay sort of situation, as it were. So that strategically is going to need to be facilitated. In other words, where are vaccine manufacturing sites going to be needed? Where are they going to be crucially required? What will they make and supply? And to ensure that their sustainability is established from the get-go, as it were. They are retaining a warm base facility. And to do that will require careful business modeling, and to map that business modeling, it's almost like you have to work backwards. You have to think about the disease management, what are the practices, the national maybe vaccine programs, and the epidemiology that will drive the vaccine manufacturing and or stockpiling strategies moving forward. So there's a lot of key lessons learned from COVID-19, as I mentioned, but really, I think the world is progressing along the track of adopting the champions, the local ownership, and I think what's happening in Africa is a perfect example of that, and it's needed arguably in other regions as well with that appropriate investment and support. And with that, I can see I've reached my allocated 6 minutes. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Remy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew. It's really wonderful to hear some positive notes on the progress being made and also the key outstanding tasks. Also, it's really good to note that the development of vaccine manufacturing capacity in other regions, like in Middle East, Latin America, and the rest of Asia could also be beneficial for equitable distribution of vaccines and also for Africa. With that note, I would like to invite Patrick Tipu. He is the Executive Director of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiatives. Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mas. Just checking if you can hear me clearly. Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege for me to represent AVMI on this forum. I think that the previous speakers covered the length and breadth of all the key issues that we all realize that we need to focus on. So a little bit about AVMI before I share some thoughts about where we are with some of these partnerships. AVMI was established more than 10 years ago with this express purpose, focus on the African continent, to say we've got to be ready. We've got to be ready while the sun's shining, we've got to prepare for the rain. And so the sun shining was the fact that we had ready access to vaccines for routine immunization purposes. Some countries procured their vaccines themselves and paid for their vaccine themselves. and others depended on, to a lesser or greater extent, on Gavi and UNICEF for their vaccine supply. So there was no real need in terms of routine vaccine immunization to disrupt what was currently at play and invest the time, effort, and money in building a vaccine production capacity for when it rained. We are in the middle of a storm now, the COVID storm, and we're looking for umbrellas and shelter. And I think that AVMI is particularly pleased that the conversation and the debate is no longer about should we, but it's now how can we and when will it happen? And how can we expedite this process of capacity building on the continent? So we're very pleased to be involved in this global discussion, but more particularly involved in a very intimate way with the efforts and the initiative under the leadership of the African CDC in the form of the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacture. We are currently engaged in supporting the workstream efforts, and BKs and others are on the forefront of this. And we really take our hats off to the African CDC team for the initiative and the progress to date. So there's a lot of attention on all of the things that we have already identified as important: the infrastructure, R&D, workforce development, the technology aspects, the intellectual property aspects, regulatory systems and capability, funding and financing, critically important, and then the market. And in our opinion as AVMI, we look back and we take a step back and we say, wow, why hasn't this happened before? What was the thing that didn't incentivize this thing from happening before? And really, it was, one could call it market failure in attracting local investments and international investments in terms of putting something on the ground in Africa. But we think the tide is changing, and there have been remarkable efforts over the recent year or two in terms of these partnerships, technology transfer partnerships being established. I'd like to just take a moment to reflect on something that Matthew mentioned, and that not only do we require multiplicity of partnerships, but these partnerships should have many dimensions to them. They need to be multifunctional, I think was the word that Matthew used. And I couldn't agree more. And so one way of looking at this is to say, well, where are we doing well currently, where the partnerships are actually being established at a reasonable pace, and that there is a reasonable engagement to deliver potential partnerships into the future. I think that in terms of formulation and filling, there's been remarkable evidence of that across the continent, from the south to the north. BioVac, the company that I work for, has had many partnerships in terms of formulation, fill, finish, drug product partnerships, the latest of which has been the deal with Pfizer. And we've seen similar reports of deals in Egypt, Morocco, Institute Pasteur in Senegal, et cetera, et cetera. So on the drug product side of things, things seem to be moving very well. And I don't think that it's by chance that that's happened, because that's a good place to start in building the capacity. And also the capacity building depends on the state of readiness. And so there's this hand in glove situation that there needs to be the ability to absorb. And as we have it, I think many of the companies and countries in Africa, that was the default starting point. But I haven't seen any evidence yet of drug substance technology transfer deals with respect to COVID or any other vaccine. And I think that's a gap that we have to, first of all, investigate and explore why is that not happening. And it might be that people are just occupied now in getting the drug product side of the business organized. But I think that that requires a little bit of a push and a nudge. We should not forget R&D, because breaking the cycle of dependence really starts with R&D capability. Because even if we have drug product capability in Africa, drug substance capability in Africa, we are still dependent on a partner to give us the technology and access to the know-how in order to make product to satisfy our needs in terms of dealing with disease outbreaks. This is not an overnight journey. We know that it's going to take 20, 30, 40 years to build, but we should not leave the R&D partnerships behind. Again, I cannot identify a significant R&D partnership that is currently underway and in progress between an African player and an overseas entity for R&D for COVID, any other pandemic vaccine, or a future routine vaccine. And I think that there needs to be more focused effort there. I think on the financing and funding side of things, we're doing pretty well. There have been a number of stakeholders. I know that we at BioVac and everywhere else on the continent, you almost need to hire a separate team just to talk to funders all the time, because there is this level of interest. So that bodes well. Our final remark, or near final remark, is that of the market. And there needs to be I think, a more integrated set of efforts in terms of connecting with the ecosystem players to ensure that the partnerships are in place, both from the push and the pull side, to create an incentivized environment for these investments to take place. Because the COVID-19 and the pandemic situation is only the tip of the iceberg. This thing is built on the part of the iceberg that floats underneath, and that is routine vaccination, so that we can leverage the capacity for the surge opportunities. And then the final remark I want to make, and that is really pointed inwards to us as Africans, is that we need to build trust and confidence through delivery, working efficiently, and working with transparency. There is no other way to get this thing moving and sustain the momentum gathered behind this if we are going to fail to deliver on our commitments. So those are a few thoughts from our side as AVMI. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. It's really good to hear the perspective from the industry angle all the time. I think you have really highlighted that now, currently, it looks different from the past, where there is a very broad engagement from development partners. It looks there will be a long-term commitment on this. Of course, we have identified key shortcomings or things that need to be developed in terms of drug substance manufacturing and R&D, and also more cooperation among players in Africa. With that, I would like to invite the third intervention by Mr. Abdul. He's the Director for Industrial and Trade Development Department at the African Development Bank. Abdul, you have the floor.
Thank you, Amis. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. And really want to thank UNCTAD and WHO for yet again convening this really important dialogue that we can continue these very helpful discussions. I think people have spoken earlier, have spoken a lot about the context, about why we're doing this, about why this is important. So I'm not really going to waste too much time on that. Rather, I'll just talk about what the African Development Bank has done and is planning to do to continue to forge strategic partnerships to help in these regards. As I mentioned in one of the fora recently, we have just launched what we call a Vision 2030, which is really an African pharmaceutical action plan. So this is really where we see the pharmaceutical sector, including vaccine manufacturing, going. in the year 2030. We did this in partnership and consultation with several stakeholders, both in Africa and outside Africa, and many organizations around the table here. We actually made some important input. The essence of the plan is really how do we move the 70% import of essential drugs that Africa does right now, how do we change that 70% to become local manufacturing? So the goal is to turn that into 70% local manufacturing of pharmaceuticals by 2030. That will call for an investment of about $11 billion from multiple stakeholders. The African Development Bank is planning to spend about $3 billion to achieve that. The plan also calls for establishment of regional hubs. As previous speakers have said, you cannot have all 54 African countries trying to do the same thing. So maybe some regional hub strategy would work, and that's what we're looking at. And then we also drill down into identifying very clear and definitive strategic initiatives that need to happen. On the vaccine side, we intend to support the Africa Union, Africa CDC vision of local 60% local manufacturing by 2040, with an investment of about $1.3 billion. So when we look at the study, like there are a couple of contextual background things that we see. Like we see this really is a huge opportunity going forward because of 4 trends that we see. The first is, of course, the impact of COVID-19 and other Africa-specific outbreaks that everybody has talked about. But second, there's also strong demand growth for vaccination. You look at it, immunization coverage in Africa is really, really low. It's estimated that about 9.4 million African children are either unvaccinated, unimmunized, or under-immunized, so 9.4 million. Second, there is also new products coming on the market, malaria vaccine that has just been approved, Lassa fever that is in development, so this is the second trend. The third one is evolving economics. So this is driven by new technologies that tend to lower down cost, production cost. So in this case, we see small scale disposable technologies coming on board, high density bioreactors coming on board, and also a lot of innovation in fill and finish technology. The last trend, of course, is the political and regulatory support that everybody has talked about. In the African Development Bank, at the onset of COVID, we received calls from at least 15 African heads of state, every single one of them saying, what do we need to do? Something has to happen. We cannot continue to work this way. And so we see this political support and will, and some of the things happening, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that has come into effect, of course, is a huge boost for manufacturing in general, but also in pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturing. And the case has talked about the AMA and what is intended to do. That's a really helpful development. So when we look at, I think Martin mentioned about 600 pharmaceutical players on the continent. On the vaccine side, we only identified about 10 really serious local vaccine manufacturing players. Most of them in North Africa, South Africa, and Nigeria, just reflecting similar to on the pharmaceutical side. 40% just doing packaging and labeling, 40% doing fill and finish, and a very small percentage doing drug substance manufacturing, if at all. So we believe that for effective progress to be made in this area, 3 things need to happen. One, we need to strongly support manufacturing plants. Long-term financing is key. Technical assistance is key, using various instruments, and there has to be some flexibility. The way people sometimes look at financing is different. When you're trying to create a whole new, basically, industry in a place with several challenges in terms of infrastructure, logistics, and so on, you need to be flexible and innovative in the way you do this financing. The second thing that needs to happen, of course, is demand pooling. There needs to be, especially with vaccines, long-term offtake agreements to support and encourage manufacturers to do to produce, but also to ensure that at least a certain percentage of demand, let's say 20 to 40%, for example, will be procured locally. Of course, there will have to be GMP compliance and all of that. The third one is, of course, to support the development of hub anchors that I mentioned, the strategy. This will require things like focus on infrastructure, logistics, putting the right policies in place, but also the institutional and regulatory frameworks for things to happen. So what has the Africa Development Bank done specifically to do this? I mentioned the $3 billion investment that we intend to do. $2 billion will be directly go into infrastructure and logistics to really create and integrate markets in the context of the AFCFTA. $1 billion will go directly into investments in manufacturing capabilities. So far in the last few months, we've identified 4 deals that we're looking at, or transactions or companies to support. One is in South Africa. It's undertaking a $300 million project to really produce COVID vaccines, but also to pivot into production of other vaccines that may be required for routine use. Second, we're also looking at a $200 million deal in Senegal. Again, this is for COVID, but also for additional vaccines. We're talking to, or already talked to 2 international pharmaceutical companies that are interested in expanding to Africa. One is going to Rwanda, the other one is still trying to decide where. So we've already earmarked for these 3 potential deals about $200 million. We're doing this as club deals, so that's where the partnership comes from. When we go in, we talk to other DFIs, and so in each of these 3 manufacturing facilities or players that we're trying to support, we're working with at least 3 to 4 other development financial institutions across the world. And this is really very, very important because we all bring different types of expertise, but more importantly, the kind of instruments we use sometimes different. Second, technical assistance. As you know, one of the challenges is really, you can talk about supporting manufacturers, but as a financier, you need to have projects and that are bankable. To reach bankability, you need to do a lot of studies. You need to feasibility studies. You need to look at all sort of things to get to that stage. Many companies don't have that capacity, and I think that's one big gap that exists, and this is where we're also trying to support. So we're working with the Senegalese government, for example, to create that capacity so that the deals that we identified in Senegal will be bankable in a very near term. Nigeria has also reached out to support some of their manufacturers that they're trying to support, and so we're working with them. But more importantly, also we're talking to some of the regional economic communities because many of them are also trying to, and again, because of, I talk about demand pooling, but also when you want to create bigger markets, you cannot be talking single countries. You need to be talking, if not Africa as a whole, but also for regional communities. So we are doing work with ECOWAS to support the development of the sector to create the necessary regulatory framework. We've also received a similar request from COMESA, and we're going to start that work very, very soon. We have reached out to private equity funds and other potential financiers on the continent. So the African Development Bank, we are a fund of funds. We've invested in the last 10 years in about 62 private equity funds. We've identified about 12 of them that are really doing a lot in healthcare and pharmaceutical sector and want to do even more. So we've reached out to them to work again together to see what kind of deals they're seeing on ground, but more importantly, how we can bring them to the table, how they can partner with us and some of the other agencies around the table to continue to support on the financing side. We're also talking to other potential financing mechanisms. So the sovereign wealth funds in various countries, because again, this is a national, these are national emergencies, and many of these sovereign wealth funds were actually set up for strategic initiatives in various countries. And so we've reached out to some of them. At least 3 have shown very, very strong interest and are taking the leadership in their various countries to convene players and also to support with direct financing into this. Pension funds, there's a lot of pension fund money in Africa that unfortunately is sitting in other parts of the world. It's not really creating value locally. So we've also reached out to a few of them to see how they can also come in as potential partners for investment, but also for to unlock that capital that is required. To conclude, the last 2 things, policy dialogue with governments is key. There need to be some basic reforms. Everybody has said it. The business environment needs to change. The infrastructure needs to be in place. Logistics need to be in place. If you want to create bigger markets, you need to integrate, all those barriers need to come down, whether they are tariff or non-tariff based barriers and so on. So we're engaging with governments, really looking at all the reforms that need to happen for this sector to flourish, and we're really supporting them in that regard. Finally, and people have talked about technology acquisition, R&D, and so on. One of the things we're trying to do, and I'm not going to say too much about it because our president, Adesina, just decided he briefed African heads of state on this initiative. We're proposing the establishment of what we call African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation. That will really create a win-win situation for acquisition of technology by local manufacturers. And we've reached out to global pharmaceutical companies that are willing to support. If people here are aware of the African Agricultural Technology Foundation that is based in Nairobi, that has really worked so well in transferring technology for really very important initiatives in agriculture. So we're trying to replicate that in the pharmaceutical sector. We've talked to a number of stakeholders. We're consulting again, and we are really calling for an establishment of this, really just to create that framework, that base, that foundation for technology acquisition by people who need it, but also in such a way that it's a win-win situation for everyone, including, of course, the innovators and the owners of the intellectual property. So I will stop here, and happy to continue to discuss, but I want to again just emphasize that this dialogue is really critical. Partnerships is really absolutely important, and we really need to look at it from all angles as we are doing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdul. Obviously, Africa and Development Bank is doing a lot, so it's not, we don't really have, we hope to have a better opportunity to discuss all of your activities. And as our Deputy Secretary General stated in the beginning, UNCTAD also will be remain to support any initiative on policy coordination angle, as well as also investment promotion. With that, I will conclude the first round of discussion, and Jiswi will facilitate the second round of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ermes. I also want to congratulate to the panelists for the first round of discussion. A lot of insightful views. So we also have an excellent panel for the second round of a discussion. The panelists will present the comments, reflections, and additional information on the activities of their respective organizations. They will also highlight what are the missing areas in partnerships, or any areas that need to be strengthened. Each speaker has 4 minutes. Now I would like to call on the first speaker, Dr. David Robinson. David is the Deputy Director of CMC, Vaccine Development and Surveillance, in Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Dr. Robinson, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here and participate in such a great panel. The advantage of being in the second panel is that many great comments have been made by the other panels. I'm not going to repeat them here, will therefore keep my remarks fairly brief. So the foundation has been involved for really more than 20 years in supporting vaccine manufacturers around the globe. And from this, we know a couple of things. One is that this can be done, that for countries and areas that want to build up vaccine manufacturing, it's been done before and it can be done again. And many of the things that are important for success there have already been mentioned by others, so I won't repeat that here. But in terms of what the foundation is doing, there are several things the foundation is going to continue to do. We've been supporting efforts for delivery. Many of my colleagues are supporting the delivery of vaccines, which is going to be critically important as we move into 2022. Regulatory strengthening, as mentioned by others, another very critical area. We're also supporting the development of new and improved vaccines for things like malaria, HIV, and TB, as was mentioned earlier, as well as providing support to many important continental initiatives, including Africa CDC and PAVM. Specifically for my group, we're really focusing on 4 things that we think are going to be important. One is to assess the market feasibility of expanding vaccine manufacturing, really to look for things to say what's going to be necessary for someone to be successful entering into what is, and I think will continue to be, a very competitive marketplace. So certainly one needs to think about a regional approach. One needs to also consider the fact that although COVID-19, the response to it, is really the driver for expanding vaccine manufacturing around the globe, it alone is not enough. It's not going to pay the bills, and as mentioned by Patrick Tipu and others, one has to look at routine vaccinations and that marketplace. In order to succeed there, small manufacturers are going to have to be competing against very large manufacturers who should enjoy the benefits of economies of scale. In light of this, we've been investing for a number of years in development of new technologies that can allow manufacturing facilities that might be producing 50 or 100 million doses a year to really compete effectively with manufacturers that might be producing hundreds of millions to billions of doses a year. And so we have been investing in new technologies for the production of viral vector-based vaccines and live virus vaccines, new technology for recombinant protein-based vaccines and subunit vaccines, as well as for production of things like monoclonal antibodies, where frankly, much more work is needed. To have monoclonal antibodies be broadly available for global access, we're going to need to decrease the cost of antibody production by another 10-fold. And that work is still in progress. And we're also, like many others now, investing into mRNA vaccine technology, looking at both opportunities to reduce the cost of some of the critical inputs, such as the lipids and enzymes required to produce mRNA vaccines, as well as new technologies to help increase the efficiency of mRNA vaccine production. We continue to use the 20 years of experience, the experience we gained over 20 years to provide technical assistance to developing country vaccine manufacturers and others. And lastly, we're focusing greater effort now on workforce development, because for companies, countries, and regions that want to expand vaccine manufacturing, having a trained workforce is going to be critical. And for rapid development of that workforce, additional assistance will be required to really develop a workforce quickly, as that's the most important component required to develop vaccines that are in an efficient manner and that are very high quality. So those are the 4 areas we're really focused on right now: is market feasibility, technology development, technical assistance, and workforce development. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and hand it back to Jussi. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you to make this a very thorough summarize for the activities supported by the foundation. Apart of what you have said, actually we all know that the foundation has been involved in stimulating and developing new technologies on vaccine manufacturing. So on behalf of all of us, we would like to thank the foundation for your support. With that, and I would like to invite the next speaker, Dr. Abdul, who is the Director for Economic and Social Development and Digitalization in GIZ. So Dr. Klapharka, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to see many colleagues here again on the panel, and many institutions and organizations being represented. We are very closely working with. I just want to share and give you an insight into some activities we are currently pursuing as GIZ. I want to focus on 3 pillars. The first is what we are doing currently country specific in Africa. The second is more on our conceptual work we are trying to push forward. And thirdly, I want to say very few words about the regional efforts we are trying to support in Africa. I think on the country-specific activities through our bilateral programs that are mainly commissioned by our federal government of Germany, we are pursuing the philosophy of really trying to contribute to broader alliances of organizations and actors from the different spheres that are required. I think the spirit of alliances and coalitions has already been highlighted during the discussions this morning. For us, I think a very good, a very pertinent example is our support and our engagement in the partnerships for the mRNA, WHO mRNA Technology Transfer Hub in South Africa. We are considering really this as a very good example of how the different partners can come together and jointly pursue a coherent strategy. Secondly, I would also want to highlight what we are trying to support now is the joint expert assignment from extensive Team Europe initiatives in Senegal. In general, we really recognize the strong political dynamic and high level political will within the countries that arises from the attention on local vaccine production. And we are actively supporting our partners to concretize the various initiatives. The only production facility that has been mentioned already currently in Africa with WHO pre-qualifications, in this case for yellow fever vaccines, is the Institut Pasteur Dakar in Senegal, and which is actually planning an expansion of its production capacity, which is again another, I think, interesting reference project in Africa currently being pursued. At the same time, we are also working very closely with the government of Ghana on a specific case for fill and finish facilities and capacities. And here we are trying to support the development of the business case. We are trying to support the different companies being potentially involved here to foster the ecosystem for their production and to link it up to the national policy for vaccine manufacturing. I think this is a very interesting case as well. I think in general, pursuing our country-specific activities, we focus very much, of course, on linking up different partnerships, I've mentioned that, and project development activities, which is, I think, still key. That has been also highlighted because there's still a missing link, I think, for financing that we really have a proper project pipeline. Secondly, on the conceptual level, I've mentioned that we are also trying still to understand better the complexities, I think all of us most likely, the complexities of vaccine market conditions, in particular in Africa. And in order to gain further insights into the market dynamics, we have commissioned a study by Professor Padmasree Gail Sampath. I think she is pretty much known in the community. And I just want to highlight a very few results that has been shared also on different occasions, because they will probably also guide us now in our future activities. I think we have seen in this study a focus on Gavi and the question on how Gavi's, the Vaccine Alliance has contributed to decreased costs for healthcare and subsequently to productivity gains. The study also highlighted the factors determining market shaping success, which are the portfolio of the vaccines and its maturity. Thus, the global COVID-19 vaccine landscape and its specificities require a market shaping strategy. And I think that is the key word here, that we really have to jointly think about how we can actually shape the markets in a way we can ensure sustainable development of markets and production capacities. The promotion of regional production should include targets for regional and national production capacities, and this should be calibrated with the COVID-19 vaccines, global access, COVAX initiative, and other Gavi procurements. To sustainably expand the market for vaccines, it's important to develop business cases and pricing strategies on African national markets, so considering the production of vaccines beyond COVID-19. GIZ will use, that's what I was saying, these findings as a basis for cooperation with partners, including those from the private sector. The second pillar of our support currently to production in Africa is more practical to the African Union institutions. I was very pleased to hear also the news from the Africa CDC earlier. So we are here in very good and very, I think, in a very good spirit of partnership, very good discussion with the various partners being involved. The focus here lies on developing local manufacturing capacity and technology transfer, regulatory frameworks for industry expertise development, and harmonization of guidelines and requirements in the African Union. We as GIZ, we support the African Center for Disease Control in implementing the partnerships for African vaccine manufacturing. Embedded advisors are currently assigned to organizational consultancy and site assessments for vaccine production facilities in 15 African countries will be carried out. In collaboration with the African Development Agency, African Union DA, NEPAD, we will further support the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. This has also been mentioned earlier, the support of the Emerging African Medicines Authority, the AMA, aims at improving regulatory authorities and knowledge management between EU member states. I think, summing up, I think we have already different activities in the pipeline. I think we also completely concur to this spirit of partnership that has been highlighted today, and we are more than ready. I think there have been discussions about how we can fill the still existing gap in technical cooperation. We are very happy to enter now into the next phase of discussions on how to fill those gaps in the months to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Klaphakar. I echoed all what you said, very, I think, very enlightening. And especially on the issues of sustainability, market shaping. Market is one of the driving forces to main sustainability. Actually, sustainability has been highlighted in several discussions, different workshops and meetings. How we can remain the facility warm, I mean, beyond COVID is a long question and a long issue we need to discuss and explore. So with that, thank you. I will move on to our final panelist, who is Dr. Stephen Karengi. Dr. Karengi is Director for the Regional Integration and Trade Division in the UNECA. So Dr. Karengi, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Jisui, and good morning, everyone. So a lot has been said, and I'm just supposed to give a commentary in a few minutes. I would start by saying that the 50 countries that Dr. Gaspar mentioned that missed the target of the 10% of the population vaccinated by September, unfortunately, 42 of those countries are in Africa. And so this conversation about local production or vaccine production in low and middle income countries, and Africa in particular, is a particularly important issue when it comes to the question of health security. Because 42 out of 54 countries in one continent, that's a huge health security risk. The second point I would want to make is that as we have seen in terms of the transmission of this virus during this pandemic, having a robust local manufacturing can actually be a very powerful tool for breaking of the transmission chain of a pandemic. So even as we talk about the business case, which I think Abdul has highlighted, and also Jisri, you've talked about market shaping, it's also important for us to think that having production closer to where the pandemic is or is likely to start or is likely to spread would actually be very helpful. Now, we've heard about the market shifts that are taking place within the continent, which of course provide opportunities to boost local manufacturing of vaccines within this continent. And I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is one of those major market shifting change that is taking place within the continent. We can talk about what is expected to be the consumer spending by 2030. It's going to be huge. So even as we think about the manufacturing, there is a strong business case because of one market that is provided by the AFCFTA. Of course, the African Medicines Agency will harmonize the rules and regulations to allow the taking into consideration of this market. Now, I'm not going to talk about what is the current state of vaccine production within the continent because we've had that. Just to say that as the Economic Commission for Africa, what it is that we are doing is actually to support the member states and also Pan-African institutions to achieve the goal of making 60% of vaccines needed in Africa by 2040, as set by the Africa CDC. So we are very much active in the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team. We've been leading one of the pillars under the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing. This is the pillar on market design and demand intelligence. And a framework for action actually has been drafted for this. And it addresses some of the issues that Abdul and Yujisui have talked about when it comes to the question of pooled procurement. And going forward, because I know we are running out of time, I cannot finish without saying that as an African institution, and of course a UN institution, we support the proposal to waive certain provisions of TRIPS for the duration of this pandemic. We believe a TRIPS waiver would be very useful and supportive of all these initiatives about manufacturing of vaccines in low and middle income countries. So let me stop there and thank you once again for having ECA as part and parcel of this presentation or this webinar. Thank you. You're muted.
Thank you very much. I believe Jisui is going to leave us soon because of her other commitment. I really appreciate the intervention by Stephen. I know your good work, especially on procurement. I think it's going to be a good experience for other initiatives, especially in vaccines. With that, we have some reactions, requests for comments, but I think it's better if I give you the floor, maybe for up to 5 panelists to react to whatever was being said. Perhaps we could start from the first panelist. Do you want to add anything? You can use the flag or just jump in. We have barely 4 minutes left. Thank you. The requests I had received so far reflects on the question of takeoff mechanisms and also food procurement and what's the scope of regional cooperation. I think those take a lot of time to distill. So maybe just if you have any quick remarks, this is an opportunity to add. Okay, Martin, you have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you. No, I just wanted to underline one thing which was mentioned by a number of panelists, the importance also of the research agenda. Because when we talk about technology transfer, I think there's often a misconception that this is just about transferring technology in its present form to places like Africa and elsewhere. Very often we know, for example, if we take the example of mRNA, we know that it's still a first generation technology with a lot of potential, but it needs to be optimized much further. Temperature stability may be moving at some point to single dose or longer intervals between doses, etc., to make it even more effective and cost effective. So technology transfer should be accompanied by a very strong research effort, including and particularly involving African researchers who know the context, who are able to identify the needs, for example, of Africa, and this is true also for other regions as well. And then, of course, as a corollary of that, you would have also the possibility to encourage entrepreneurship, because we know how the pharmaceutical sector works. Very often the innovation is driven by academics, by researchers, and then that is often taken up and expanded and developed into full industrial scale. So I just wanted to highlight that. And in Europe, as you know, we have the clinical trials partnership with Africa, where a number of very promising candidates, including some new technologies, which have the potential to finally give us a better handle on some long-standing health issues. But again, this brings us back to the regulatory aspect, because you cannot have clinical trials or research if there isn't also strong, effective governance. So all this is intertwined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's really important, actually. Yes, perhaps we come to the conclusion of this meeting. On behalf of UNCTAD, I would like to thank all panelists and participants for their contributions. As our Deputy Secretary General indicated in her opening remarks, UNCTAD will continue to contribute to the global effort to build the vaccine manufacturing capacity in LMICs. And with that, I would like to thank you and say, okay, goodbye. Jiswi, are you still with us? Thank you very much. I think Jiswi also has left. So thank you all and have a good day. I will send you a report on the outcome of
I'm here, Emirs.
Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you, Emirs. I would also like to thank you all. And WHO is one of the leading organizations in supporting member states to build a sustainable capacity in the production of vaccines, medicines, and other health technologies. So we will continue to engage with all the partners, with you all, in pursuing this endeavor, including through the WHO new initiative, the World Local Production Forum. So thank you again and take care. Goodbye. Thank you, Emirs.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.